Thanks all of you for joining us today. Just to get a read here, how many people saw the related presentation on the main stage just a little while ago? Okay, pretty much everyone. Okay, excellent. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail. Basically, the presentation here is going to be use those slides as anchors. If I could see it, it'd be helpful. There you go. And then build in a little bit more of the data that we have. And we have tons and tons of data. So we had a partner session on this ground truth work on the 27th of January. We had something like 53 slides. The last, what feels like decade of my life has been taken up in synthesizing those and reducing it down to the small deck that you saw this morning. But there's a whole lot of stuff which is super interesting, which is left over, which I want to share with you today. And I think we're also privileged to be joined here today by a number of the partners in the study. And I see Maggie and Preeta from Analytic Partners. Do we have Bob Pasikoff from Brand Keys here as well? I think we do. Good morning, Robert. And we have Millwood Brown, I believe in the audience somewhere. Bill Havlina, I think. Hey, Bill. Do we have anyone from Marketing Evolution here? Not yet. Okay. And ComScore workers in here too, and also some guidance from TRA, and there's obviously Bill Harvey in the corner. So thank you all very much, and thanks for being here to answer the difficult questions too. So, just to recap what we did here, our mantra is collaborate, invest, and do. So we convened the industry leaders at JFK's offices downtown Manhattan last year and said, okay, what are the key issues for us to look at in terms of how advertising works today? You know, we've looked at this many times over our history, but now, given the consumer behavior has changed so much, what are the critical areas? And they defined 3 experiments for us, basically, in which we've invested $1 million. And those 3 experiments were cross-platform ROI, which platform should I use? Cross-platform interactions, it was called at the time, which morphed into the cross-platform, the creative and the neuroscience piece. And then third, what should I do about mobile? So I'm going to talk to you today about the cross-platform ROI experiment. So the definitive answers that we're looking to provide here, or the roadmap to smart spending, as we're calling it, is based on these questions. How should I invest? Should I invest or should I shift? The second thing is, which platform should I invest in? The third piece is, we hear all about millennials cutting corners and only using mobile, et cetera, et cetera. And given that context, how should we reach millennials from an ROI perspective? What's the optimal mix for millennials? The fourth question is around about optimizing digital spend. And we have a couple of really, what I might call killer slides, I think, in this presentation that weren't in the one upstairs, which I think everyone will find really interesting. And then fifth, and by no means least, what should creative strategy be across platforms? So we saw upstairs basically the first ground truth that we established is that advertising works across platforms. More platforms delivers higher ROI. So if you look at the average 2-platform campaign, just to reiterate what we went through upstairs, it performs 19% more effectively than a single platform campaign. Right at the other end of the scale, we have 35% increase in ROI when you have 5 platforms versus 1. And yet the context in terms of advertisers is the fact that only fully 29% of campaigns only exist on one platform only. So our message here to the industry is add a platform. If you're only conducting advertising on one single platform, then add another one and your ROI is going to go up. The second ground truth was looking at those magical combinations. So what are the combinations of media? You know, if I'm making a step from 1 platform to 2 platform, are there any magical combinations that I need to be aware of? So we established here that not only do print and TV together and radio and TV together outperform TV campaigns, but particularly mixing traditional and digital media really, really reaps rewards to the tune of 160% ROI, 60% over a TV campaign only. So one question that we then asked ourselves is, how does that differ across categories? Now, earlier in the deck upstairs, I just pulled out one digital tactic. If you recall, I was looking at TV plus paid search, and we were drawing conclusions there, basically, that lower brands in lower involvement categories, for example, brands in food and bev. And
can you just speak up a bit? You're competing with a noisy airman.
So we were looking at TV plus paid search a little while ago, and we saw that for brands in food and beverage and household and lower involvement categories, that it's very difficult to use those digital tactics per se, but also in terms when you combine it with TV. However, for brands in higher involvement categories, so pharma and travel were the 2 that we looked in there. I think it would not be too far of a stretch to say that finance would behave in a similar way. You should double down on that investment of traditional and digital together, because the ROIs, the synergies, the whole is very much greater than the sum of its parts. Now, we want to go into a little bit more detail on that. So what these figures are showing here is the kicker effect, as we're calling it, the TV and digital combination, and how that works when you index it to performance of traditional campaigns only. So hidden, not shown on this slide, is the average of TV plus radio and TV plus print, which is indexed and restrained artificially to $1. And what we can see is for certain categories, there's a little bit of a lift between traditional and digital when you mix those two types of platform. However, for some categories, it's not quite literally off the charts, but it's pretty high, right? If you look at categories like travel, entertainment, and pharma particularly, a real upside in combining traditional and digital. So one of the questions we were asking ourselves is, why is that? You know, the original hypothesis that I went into this research with when we saw this behavior was that it was all about information. Consumers go online to find information. And I think, I dare say that would be, you know, a lot of people's hypothesis. We're looking at the hypothesis that I went into this research with once we saw these patterns was that, in fact, it was all about information. But in fact, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. Certainly, categories where looking for information is important are those where there's that synergy between digital and traditional is particularly magical. But it also applies to categories which are time sensitive. That explains the travel category, for example. It also applies to health related. So we're looking at pharma and OTC. That kicker effect is really powerful in those categories too. Categories where recommendations are particularly important, obviously rely on that synergy between traditional and digital. And finally, categories which are at high risk, high financial cost, and so on, are particularly impacted by that synergy as well. So critically, if you think about the roles of different media platforms, it's really important to distinguish between how they affect engagement as well. And I'm not using engagement in the sense of retweets or likes or any of that kind of social behavior type engagement, but more engagement where it means the ability to communicate the category ideal. So you can see very clearly that different platforms have different behaviors or different strengths, rather, when it comes to communicating that engagement. So just pulling out a couple of platforms here. TV, for example, contributes a lot to engagement in household and then food and bev, but less so when it comes to personal. For mobile, however, you can see a different pattern. So mobile is very, very powerful in communicating the category ideal in the personal categories, and to a slightly lesser extent in food and bev, but not so much in household. So we have a ton more data of this type as well, which is super interesting. Going into digital for a little bit now, we see the massive amounts, the double-digit growth in digital, led predominantly by the 38.9 or whatever that percentage is in mobile spend. I think it's 39. Just pulling out a few tactics here, you know, you can see the $6 billion spent on desktop banner, on desktop video, the $17 billion in mobile banner, massive amount, and then $4 billion for mobile video. And what we wanted to do earlier on, we showcased the frequency aspects here. So, you know, what does it look? What is that curve of effectiveness in terms of digital? And we established that once you get to a certain amount per month, that in fact they can have a negative effect. The break is in fact at 35. But what we also wanted to do, and we didn't showcase earlier on, was compare, the performance of, actually before I skip on, there's one more chart which I think is interesting to share here. It's also linked to the ComScore work that was shared this morning. So if you take 100 gross impressions, and this is really about establishing the opportunity for advertisers in terms of digital advertising, grabbing the low-hanging fruit, if you will. If you take the average campaign of 100 gross impressions, and then you take out the impressions which are non-human traffic or not viewable, you're left with 43 impressions. Then when you take that out again and remove the impressions that were over-delivered, you're left with 33 useful impressions or impactful impressions. So very clear to me there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, okay? So the bottom line on this slide, there's a lot of upside in digital if you can manage it right through implementing optimizing towards viewable impressions, working against non-human traffic. And there's some fascinating work that was done by the ANA at the back end of 2014, I think it was, which was recently updated. It was done in conjunction with White Ops. What they were doing was basically outlining some guidelines for making sure you don't serve your advertising to bots. You know, one of the obvious ones, for example, is don't serve your ads in the middle of the night because no one's up then apart from the bots, right? So that's really good work for advertisers to have a look at. And critically, the over-delivery piece as well is very important to optimize for. The over-delivery part is also particularly egregious particularly a problem in mobile versus desktop, which is interesting to me. So if you look at the performance there, you can make the inference that it's actually more of a problem in mobile, as well as, aside from the numbers, it's more of an issue, I should say, in mobile, in the sense that when you're on a mobile device, if you're over delivery, it's actually potentially more offensive to you because maybe it's a full screen ad, which for desktops is obviously very much the minority of impressions. So we want to pivot now and start to think about the different platforms and formats in digital media. And these are a couple of what I think are really important charts that we couldn't squeeze in from a time perspective into this morning's presentation. But if we look here at the performance of video advertising versus banner or display advertising, you can see a massive uptick in the ROI of video. So almost 2x. This is ROI as well. Similarly, when we look at mobile versus desktop, you can see an even greater jump. So you look at mobile video versus desktop video, you can see it outperforms to the tune of 226% effectively. And just spinning back to the stats that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, if you think about the $17 billion spent on mobile banner, for example, this kind of finding puts that kind of spend in a different light. I think there's a real big opportunity for advertisers to spend in a more optimal fashion. Moving on to social now, one area we didn't really cover in this morning's presentation. You can see that social media spend is rising. These stats are from the Duke, AMA, Deloitte CMO survey that comes out every 6 months. Massive uptick in social media spending, really huge percentages of marketing spend, and yet there's a measurement problem there. I think the same survey found that only 1 in 10 marketers actually feels they're able to measure social media in an effective way. So one thing which we found in our data, which was really interesting, it comes from IRI data, is looking at the role of social. What we tried to do was establish what the different roles for these different platforms were in the context of customer acquisition or customer retention. Were certain platforms better for acquisition, or were certain platforms better for retention? And you can see here that social is very much stronger in terms of customer acquisition, apparently, than it is for retention, which was an interesting finding for me. And you could make the theoretical link. You could say, okay, if I'm having a tough time in measuring my social media, what's the metric I should use? Much like Johnny Barrett was talking about earlier on, the influence metric, right? You could say, okay, the business metric, maybe we're talking about customer acquisition, given social strength in that regard. Finally, we talked about earlier on about the using unified campaign. So the question was, what should my creative strategy be across platforms? Should it be a unified strategy, or should it be a disparate or disconnected, where I'm using different agencies for digital and for TV and so on? So we established very clearly, this is using Millward Brown data, established very clearly that unified campaigns are more impactful. So there are two types of unified campaign. One is the unified campaign where the creative is exactly the same. So you're taking your TV campaign and you're taking that 30-second spot and you're just putting it onto a digital channel. That's one type of unified campaign. The other type of unified campaign is one where the creative is linked thematically in terms of messaging, characters, taglines, etc., etc. So those two types of campaign way outperform non-unified campaigns. There's one exception in terms of which one is more powerful of the two unified strategies. There is, I think, Bill, correct me if I'm wrong, from Millward Brown, there's a potential that when you're looking to build awareness, that a unified campaign that uses the same creative is in fact more impactful than having slightly different executions. And this slide also shows the number of campaigns basically in the study, in which we think is relatively representative of the broader population in terms of how many campaigns exist of those types. So we can see it's around about 20% of campaigns are non-unified. So there's a massive opportunity here for advertisers to take those campaigns and turn them into either unified campaigns with the same execution or unified campaigns with custom executions. And it's the purple area of the chart here which is the most impactful type of campaign, with the possible exception of when you're trying to build awareness. So to summarize, the ground truths and the action steps that we're suggesting here is, first of all, invest across platforms. Secondly, there is magic in certain combinations, particularly traditional and digital together. Third, that absolutely applies for millennials, contrary to what some of us might think. Fourth, in terms of digital, there's a lot of optimization in digital, particularly in terms of frequency and not over-delivering. And fifth, unified campaigns are the way forward for better creative. Okay.